what? I think now is the time to get going. If I'm smiling a little more than usual, or happier than usual, I think there's a reason. The topic of today is once again professional sports. I spent the better part of the early morning down at the river just thinking about pro sports and the role that it's literally played in shaping who I am, as well as those that I care about most. Recalled my first road trip to Edmonton, where I got to see my best buddy Ryan Beta play his first NHL game and score his first NHL goal. And this was the same kid that 20 years earlier had been shooting, shots on me in the backyard on that backyard rink. I thought back to the road trips that I would take with my dad from Saskatoon to Regina to see the Rough Riders play. And these are my heroes at the time, and I didn't know any different. A few years later, 20 years later, some of these heroes were becoming, some of my best friends. With G. Roy Simon did on the field of the Grey Cup, where they took home the Grey Cup on home turf. Being able to witness his 2 touchdowns as his special guest, meant a lot. And I still think about the goosebumps that that game gave me. And as you can see, I look for any opportunity to throw on the Rider green, from hat all the way down to the socks. And that will never change. I think back to the Batista bat flip. That gave me goosebumps. It's an episode that I'll never forget, but it's for a bit of a different reason. Yes, that moonshot that he hit to the upper deck of the Sky Dome was compelling, but it was more the line drive that my buddy Wes McDougall took off his groin a couple pitches earlier off the bat of Vince Donaldson that I remember most. I think back to, a recent Grey Cup and Matt Black and his game-winning interception, and the tears that were running down my face, knowing the backstory to that entire season and how he was able to cement that win for the Argos. Whether it's basketball games, hockey games, baseball games, I've got to attend these with pretty much every front-runner team member. Trips to San Francisco with Eben to see the Broncos take home the Lombardi Trophy. The road trip to Denver with Elizabeth and Mile High, pretty lit trip to say the least. The inaugural trip to Buffalo just this past year with a few team members, where we got to join Bill's Mafia for the first time, and meetings that we take courtside with, the likes of Matt and Jesse, Dan, and so forth, and Raptor playoff games with Leonard, Sean, and Janet, who are all on this call. Guy Tallman, who's on this call, got to take in, the Seattle Seahawks. Unfortunate loss at the Super Bowl there in Arizona. And at the end of the day, Frontrunner is a true legion of sports fans. We run. That's what we do. Yesterday, as many of you probably saw 100 times over on social media, marked the year anniversary of the shot. Leonard the Claw took the inbound pass, headed straight for the baseline. He set and he unleashed arguably the most magical moment in Canadian sports history, and arguably one of the biggest moments in sports history in its totality. I got a chance to watch sort of the cell phone video that I took of that shot, and I think what was most striking was the silence that overtook the stadium as it went from air to rim to rim to rim to win. It connected the collective consciousness of our entire nation. And it set forth a legendary run that I don't think any of us will ever forget. And as fate would have us, a month later, I got an opportunity to sit courtside to see the Raptors take home that championship. And that's the power of professional sports, is it's literally indescribable. Right now, the Raptors should be amidst another championship run. And most assuredly, the Leafs will be coming off another first-round exit. But as we know, a newfound public enemy got in the way by the number 19. And it's with this cold, hard fact in mind that I'd like to introduce you to the luminary for today, John Kosner. And he has a thing to say about that. This is a man who played a massive role in shaping professional sports as we know it today. John is a business, editorial, and multimedia product executive who built ESPN into world's leading digital sports destination, increasing traffic tenfold, and transforming an unprofitable business into ESPN's fastest growing. He's a recruiter and a champion of working with diverse teams. He's an innovator in streaming, video on demand, fantasy games, podcasting, digital and audio, online advertising, as well as strategic partnerships. John played a pivotal role in all major ESPN rights acquisitions and initiatives, leveraging a super deep network in media, technology, and sports for over 4 decades. John has a stunning grasp of storytelling and has a unique sort of innate ability to focus on crisp messaging. And most recently, he partnered with the late, great David Stern to, again, redefine what the future of sports will look like. And John, with that, I'll turn it over to you to shed some much needed light today.
Hey, thank you, Nathan. And good morning, everybody. I hope you're all safe and sound. I'm talking to you from the Upper West Side in New York City. And, although the numbers are terrible, they're getting better here. And we've benefited from the work of our governor, Andrew Cuomo, and all the brave people here in New York City. Little bit about my background, and I certainly appreciate the intro from Nathan. I'm one of the few people that you'll ever meet who has gotten to do the jobs that he dreamed of doing as a kid. I'm a native of New York City, and I grew up here in the 1960s and 70s, and I was obsessed with sports on television. We didn't travel much when I was a kid, but sports television took me everywhere. I learned geography, math, storytelling, character, all through watching sports on TV. It was mesmerizing to me. But I always dreamed about more. I wanted a product that could combine the live sporting events I watched with a print narrative, photography, video highlights, real-time stats, and scores. ESPN.com, which is the product that I'm most associated with, did not exist when I was growing up. Didn't exist when I was in college. Didn't exist when I started my career. It didn't even exist halfway through my career. But I've always followed my passion. And I think there's a lesson there for all of us as the pace of change is only accelerating. And I know you see that in your own business. After I graduated from college at Stanford University, I got my first job at CBS Sports. Then I was in charge of broadcasting at the National Basketball Association. This was during the Dream Team era. So for any of you who are watching the outstanding documentary, The Last Dance, I was there for most of it. I also worked closely on the NBA's launch in Canada, in Toronto, and Vancouver in 1994. From the NBA, I went to Sports Illustrated, where I was there for a couple of years, and then to ESPN for over 20 years, where for the last 15, I was in charge of ESPN.com. And as Nathan said, the app, fantasy sports, podcasting, streaming, etc. Truly a dream job. After I left ESPN, I reunited with the late NBA commissioner, David Stern, and we created a portfolio of sports tech startups, which we lovingly called micromanagement ventures. For any of you who are familiar with David's legend, the name pretty much summarized what the approach was. And as Nathan mentioned, David suffered a brain hemorrhage last December, and he died on New Year's Day. It's a very sad start to what continues to be a rugged year for all of us, and certainly for sports. With David gone, my work with our sports startups continues, and I still love what I do. And to me, that's the most important thing in your career, is to love what you do. So today, briefly, we're going to talk about what's next in sports. This is a picture of the Korean Baseball League being broadcast by ESPN these days, where in place of crowd, they're putting up visuals of crowds. Yeah. Jason Gay in the Wall Street Journal wrote recently that the pandemic shutdown is nothing less than the most seismic disruption in the history of sports. The economic impact of what's happening now will be vast. The way games at every level will be played and viewed is likely to change forever. Every athlete on earth will remember this time for the rest of their lives. Economic impact, for context, is huge. Projecting $12 billion in revenue lost, hundreds of thousands of jobs. That could more than double depending upon what happens with pro and college football season in the US this fall. Adam Silver, the NBA commissioner, says there's still too much uncertainty at this point to say precisely how we move forward. We'll talk more about that. No less an expert than my dad frequently talks about how in life you frequently just have bad options. And so you have to choose between the least terrible of two decisions. And when we talk about sports and when you observe what's going on, you'll see how much that comes into play. So when you have a cataclysm like COVID-19, it tends to accelerate key trends that were already in development. In sports, a key trend that's accelerating is esports. Prior to COVID-19, esports was the third most popular spectator sport behind the NFL and the NBA for the really attractive demo between ages 13 and 35. And 10% of that audience was already watching a considerable amount of esports. With no live sports available, virtually every rights holder has created virtual simulation versions of their product. ESPN has been broadcasting a tournament of NBA 2K featuring actual NBA players. One thing I think you're going to see is that traditional sports increasingly are going to follow the lead of esports and gaming, not the other way around. It's not a coincidence that the chief marketing officer at the NBA, Kate Chavari, her previous job was at Twitch. The landscape that I want to share is that esports is part of a broader revolution happening in media. And that is that there's an ever-expanding, practically infinite supply of interesting content available for audiences under 30, which is free. And you're all familiar with what I'm talking about. It's on networks like YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Snap, and Twitter. A friend of mine from Twitter recently asked me what my prognosis was for Quibi, the new pay service offering mobile video. And I said I thought it was dead on arrival, not because they didn't have talented people, not because they weren't going to try hard, but because so much content, including content for your phone, is available for free, and the audience knows where to find it. This viewing revolution is distinguished by our ability to watch whatever we want, whenever and wherever. For young audiences, that watching increasingly means playing games whenever and wherever. In chess, for instance, COVID-19 caused the cancellation of the FIDE tournament, but that did not keep the chess grandmaster Magnus Carlsen and 7 of his colleagues from staging their own online tournament, which ended earlier this month with Magnus winning. Among the innovations were chess matches played in as few as 15 minutes. Many of you hopefully are watching the outstanding documentary, The Last Dance, which has averaged between 5 and 6 million viewers every episode, which is great. The NFL draft, which is held in Roger Goodell's basement, had 15.6 million TV viewers in the first round. But I want to call your attention to the number of people who participated on Fortnite in the Travis Scott concert, practically 28 million. All of this activity is putting U.S. linear pay television into decline. We saw that Netflix added 16 million subs in the first quarter. Without live sports in the U.S., 2 million people cut the cord. And this is really lifeblood for sports, certainly in the United States. It means less money to invest in sports rights for the TV networks. It means less advertising dollars against sports content because fewer people are going to be watching. It has put college sports in our country into peril. You saw the NCAA tournament canceled in March. It's not clear when college football will play this fall, if it will play at all. And then there's a domino effect that affects both men's and women's sports, because with the revenue loss from college basketball and likely from college football, you may see the cancellation of many men's and women's programs, which is going to have a profound impact on not just college sports, but sports in general. Also, this year, we saw two of the top U.S. high school players go directly to the NBA's development league, the G League, from high school. They will not play college basketball next year. So where are we? The two key issues with getting started are safety, and that's tied into testing. Henry Abbott, who's the editor of a terrific NBA blog called True Hoop, says, restarting will mean testing like crazy, which will either mean solving the nation's testing crisis or grand scale cutting in line. So you can clearly see that it's not just the availability of testing that's a challenge for sports, but also the public relations that somehow you could be interfering with more needy people getting access to testing. Because without testing, we really don't know who's sick and who's not. We also have just the economic impact. This obviously is as profound in Canada as is in the US, but Mary Meeker said 73% of Americans indicated that their household incomes are going to be reduced. So this runs through everything impacting sports. Bill Gates made the point that the chance of mass spread at sporting events is quite large. So consequently, you're not going to see people in the stands anytime soon for sports. To start playing again, there is just a set of challenges confronting sports rights holders. In the US, you need federal, state, local. In some cases, you need country approvals. You guys may have read that Major League Baseball is planning to try to start their season on July 1st. One of the issues that they're dealing with is so many of the players have gone home to the Dominican Republic. Some have gone back to Venezuela. It's not trivial getting players back. In addition, Prime Minister Trudeau has said that if U.S. players come over to Canada, they have to quarantine for 14 days, and all of these leagues, NBA, NHL, MLB, all play in Canada as well. So that's to be managed. Then you have to think about the safety and security of venues, getting venues with multiple locker rooms, which is what NHL is trying to do as they consider a model of playing in a handful of cities rather than all of them. What hotels do you stay at? How do you do transportation, security? How is television production handled? Do you have appropriate medical staff, and can you do that without taking away from the essential workers needed for the cities in which the players play? Then there is a whole spate of collective bargaining issues between the owners and players, trying to agree to how they share a smaller pie of revenue when there's all of a sudden no gate and no agreement. The players have to deal with separation from their families, which could be extended. What do you do when you have a child that is born or someone who dies? How do you manage the school year? And in another non-trivial instance, the players haven't been training. So it's not easy to get them all up and going. It will take weeks in order to get them all up and going. And especially when you think about, say, NBA and NHL, where you may choose to go directly to the playoffs and play the most important game. The likelihood of injuries is profound and a big risk. Who will come back when? I like the hand that golf has, because golfers already play at a distance. If you ask them the truth, I think they'd rather play with nobody in the stands. They are, to me, well situated to get much of their season in. You saw UFC come back in Florida on Saturday night. NASCAR comes back tonight. The Bundesliga is scheduled to start, I believe this weekend. Major League Soccer has been planning their return. I mentioned Major League Baseball is trying to come back in July. The NBA and NHL are both looking at models potentially to play in fewer markets and try to get their postseason in. The NBA is specifically looking at Orlando. They may play some games at Walt Disney World, as well as Las Vegas. Both of those sports are likely to push back the start of their 2020-21 season potentially into December or even January. Tennis will try to come back this summer, but as the most international sport, it has the most complications to deal with in terms of getting groups of players together, dealing with quarantining. You saw that the NFL put out their schedule last week, but they're organized in a way that they could slide their schedule back as late as October 15th and still get their season in. For those of you who are CFL fans, there's considerable doubt the CFL will play this year. The CFL, actually, without some assistance from the government, may not be able to stay in business, which would be a really crushing blow to many sports fans. When sports do come back, what are we looking at? Well, we're looking at no fans, at least to start. You will see a bunch of innovation come to telecasts. Use of artificial intelligence, augmented reality, the potential of piped-in crowd noise. You can have the phenomenon of all sports playing at the same time, which will make it very complicated for advertisers and broadcasters to figure out how to schedule and allocate marketing dollars. In a world where you can't go to a game, you can't go to a sports bar, you can't have anybody over to watch the game other than people in your own family, perhaps, we're probably going to see the advent of more watch party technology to help make sports more compelling. When fans are allowed to return, you're going to see phasing in of crowd sizes. It could start at 20% and then gingerly move up. You'll see heat checks when you check in, more Clorox bleach wipes than you could wave a stick at. There's a lot of development now of hands-free technology. I know you guys are pioneers in looking at gestures. That is likely to come to arenas and stadiums. You'll have grab-and-go food. Personalization is likely to expand. They'll know who you are when you arrive. You'll have your food delivered. And we're going to see acceleration in sports betting as sports leagues and states in the U.S. look to accelerate revenue. Terrific Toronto-based sports application, The Score, actually has its own sports book in New Jersey, so they have the potential to grow as well. If there's any silver lining moral in this sort of dark picture I'm painting, it's that I think we're going to have increased awareness and appreciation for how important fans are, in making sports what they are and making the atmosphere what they are. Nathan told those stories of all of you who've been to games. We're going to miss them at the stadium. And I think professional and college sports organizations that champion their fans, that make them whole, that recognize their value really stand to gain in the post-COVID world that, of course, can't arrive quick enough. So very nice to be with you today. Time permitting, I'm happy to do questions, and I truly appreciate the invitation.
John, what a masterful presentation. Efficient, alarming, eye-opening, everything in between. Certainly grateful for it. I think everybody on this call, every front runner is a big-time sports fan. So if you have some time, I expect a series of questions here. So maybe I'll turn it over to perhaps the biggest, and Jesse Wolf out of New York. And Jesse, I know you have a question or two for John here this morning.
Yep. Hey, John. Nice to meet you in Hopewell as well. I'm a fellow Upper West Side native. I grew up there. Was born up there. I grew up on 72nd up by Central Park.
And where'd you go to school?
Heschel.
Okay, nice. Yes.
Yeah. I was able to get out of the city. I don't live there anymore. I live down in Chelsea, but my lease was coming up and I was able to get out. So, but all my family is still there, and it's definitely, how we're feeling it is probably very different than, how other parts of the country are feeling it in Canada as well. So it's definitely have a different mindset. And I can spend, an hour with you alone with so many questions, but I'll try to keep it to a couple. You mentioned the concept of least worst that your father, taught you. My father taught me risk reward. And I wonder if with all the things that you mentioned about, how sports would go about coming back, whether that's, you know, baseball in a bubble kind of setting where they're all in one place, or however they do it. Is it putting, the real question is, what's this all worth really? And I get the economic impact, but, you know, for example, I think there was a restaurant they showed in Georgia or Colorado that opened with shower curtains between booths, and no one came because we don't go to restaurants to sit with, you know, shower curtains between our booths. Is all these things that we're trying to mitigate, you know, the worst case scenario, which is more outbreak, is it worth it to put those in place when we're not getting the true experience that fans want? And I just kind of, if you can talk about overall the risk reward factor, or is it better just to say, you know, let's sit and not do anything as long as possible, and then we'll come back as close to normal as possible, as opposed to putting on a bunch of Band-Aids?
So what I think you're going to observe is sports organizations trying to mitigate the economic damage to themselves by trying to figure out ways to come back, because for some the alternative is just going out of business. We're seeing that, for instance, in the CFL discussion. In technology, and, you know, I'm sure in your business we talk a lot about, you know, trying to make incremental improvements, trying to figure out things as we go along. So I think for many sports fans, the idea of trying to figure out something that could bring sports back in some form, presuming that you can do it safely, I would think that, and I'm no expert on the exact numbers, but I would think a majority of fans would support some sort of experimentation to figure it out. Dr. Fauci was talking to Peter King, the Pro Football Reporter, the other day, and Peter King said, well, what do you do if like 3 of your offensive linemen are positive? And Dr. Fauci said, you got to shut it down, because that means that the spread within the team is more profound than just the 3 that have been identified. But this is the kind of terrifying scenario that leaders of sports face, because we don't know. And that's why the testing is super important. And even there, it's an inexact science. So you're going to see a lot of complicated discussions where people are going to have to make judgments and they don't have all the facts. The players are in certain ways sort of gambling with their own health. In my experience, and I don't mean to be callous, you know, in pro sports, you tend to follow the money. So I would expect that there's going to be a lot of these games coming back in different forms. As to how good that experience is, how fans embrace it, we shall see. I was talking yesterday to Kendall Baker, who is the editor of Axios Sports newsletter. I don't know if any of you guys get it, but he's terrific. And Axios Sports, a great daily newsletter. And we were talking about the technology that's likely to come into play to try to make sporting events with no crowd more interesting. I think that's going to be super important. And some of the things that will come out of that, I believe, will sustain once we get past and we're into a new normal where fans are back in sports. Unfortunately, the overall answer to you is unsatisfactory because we don't have all the facts. And I suspect there's some amount of risk that's going to be taken. And I'm hopeful that that doesn't result in anything terrible happening.
Thank you.
I'm going to turn it over to Guy Tallman. So Guy is in from Regina, Saskatchewan, the home of the Rough Riders. So to hear that there might not be a season, let alone a future, I'm sure is disconcerting to him. But Guy is one of my great friends and I know a great follower of sports. Do you have a question for John today?
Sure. Thanks, Nathan. And thanks for doing this, John. I'm curious to what you think, what will happen with salaries. I've already, just yesterday, I heard, I can't remember his name and I should, because he's a pretty high up sports agent saying that there's no way that these players are going to drop 30% in salaries yet. They're only going to play 50% of the games. And I just think, I wonder what your thoughts are that not being able to go to a live game. For example, I wonder what will happen to hockey in the United States, and where they still call it ice hockey. And And so I just wonder what do you think will happen with the salaries, and if not just the CFL, if a lot of these teams will survive. Because watching a game on TV with no fans in it, it'll seem awkward to me. Thank you.
Yeah, and listen, it's a great question. I believe we are going to see a correction in the whole system. There's going to be less money and everything is going to come down. And that means that, the rights that are paid for sports are likely to come down. The prices to go to games when you can go to games is going to come down. The collective amount of money in the system will mean that both owners and players will have to accept less. A friend of mine told me that the MVPs when sports comes back are going to be the attorneys because there are going to be so many issues and disputes. Overall, however, I think that this could be better, meaning that there could be an appreciation for the things that matter in sports, including fans. There could be better development of personalized services for fans. Could be opportunities for companies like yours. Certainly, I think you're going to see some teams, potentially some sports, go out of business or get sort of reconceived. Pay television in the U.S. has really been the bulwark of sports since I've been in my career. The amount of money you pay for pay television channels goes to the leagues and then split between owners and players. If there's less money in that system, there's just less money in sports. So you will hear all of this sort of each side will take their own traditional positions. I wouldn't possibly do it for that. I wouldn't possibly, but in the end, I think they will make a deal that will wind up with less for everybody, including less in player salaries.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, John. On our call today, we have our partner, Jeff Lake. Side note to Jeff Lake is he was actually Gordie Howe's PR agent for many, many years. So Mr. Hockey and Jeff went sort of hand in hand. So Jeff, I know I'm putting you on the spot, but as a true sportsman, wondering if you have any questions for John here this morning.
I sure do, and it's a real honor to speak with you, John. And
thank you.
I really mean that. I'm a longtime PR guy, and I'd like you to speak about David Stern's brilliance. He resurrected a league that was fourth, I think, in the U.S. to what it is today, and I just think that's a remarkable achievement in strategy, public relations, and just overall. Revenue. They have now the highest paid athletes in North America, and it's truly a great game. But I believe he was the architect of that resurrection, correct?
Yes. Pro basketball is my favorite sport. You guys were telling anecdotes of the Toronto Raptors run last year, which I thought was epic, and I really enjoyed it. The fact that I love pro basketball so much is how I got to the NBA in '87. And we were just a couple of years out of the dumpster when I joined. I remember David, who's got a great sense of humor, came down to talk to me, and he said, we're kind of like an adult movie. Our fans like us, but they don't like themselves for liking us. And his theory was, you have to fix all the systemic problems first, then you have to market the hell out of your product. So he took a league that was perceived to be too black, only the last 2 minutes mattered, had a drug problem, and out of that, he created the first sort of collective bargaining agreement with a salary cap that generated a sort of equal level playing field among the teams. He put in a universal drug policy, but mostly he created a sense of partnership with everyone who dealt with the NBA, whether it's the players or networks. We negotiated very aggressively, but David always said to me that the best deal is that which can be renewed. And so he was very focused that partners would get value out of any deal. And he was a visionary guy. And what's super interesting about him is he grew up you know, the son of a guy who managed a delicatessen. He was a lawyer. He had no background in any of the things that he became really known for. And he just spent his time learning things, hiring smart people, and he just worked. He just worked relentlessly. When, you know, in the same conversation, when he made the joke about the adult film, he said, "How are you doing?" And I said, "I've never worked so hard." And he said, "Great." He said, "If you do that the next 18 years, you know, maybe you might get close to like where I am." And so he was unique, and he was just a visionary, terrific guy, and did a really good job as a sort of mentor for entrepreneurs in his second act. So you see his fingerprints all over sports.
Yes, thank you for that.
And in knowing the players that I do, I know there was a deep appreciation through the players and the PA sort of him as well. And you saw that sort of on New Year's Day on his passing, and how much he comes up time and again in sort of that role on sort of that level that I don't think any commissioner previous to or since has had, that's for sure. Janet Weiss, I know you're a massive sports fan. Wondering if you have a question for John here today.
Yeah, absolutely. And John, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
I'm interested in the semi-professional leagues. And is this the death nail for them, or is this the renaissance where the playing field gets leveled out a bit in terms of exposure when you're basically all competing over the internet, and how we should be thinking about them going forward?
To me, you know, this is an unsatisfactory answer. So the answer is yes. Okay. And what I mean unsatisfactory is it's all going to be about the management. If you're running grassroots events or, like, you know, a niche sport, it's all about how you build your audience, how you have that community figure out being able to assemble audience, advertisers that are interested in it. There's less money, obviously, in streaming than in taking a rights fee and being on ESPN, but that's increasingly where these things are headed. I was thinking, I mean, this is a small example, but, you know, along with the work that I do for startups, I also do consulting, and with a friend, a former NBA executive named Ed Desser, I also help negotiate media properties. So last summer, we were negotiating a property, which is the Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association. So, so you know them from the Calgary, from the Calgary Rodeo and other stuff, and they had a deal with the CBS Sports Network, and it was a relatively small deal. You know, I think it was good programming for CBS, but it wasn't sort of core to what they do. And that deal expired, and we wound up making a deal with a small television network called Rural Media, RFD TV. And what has happened is that the smaller television unit, which really services sort of rural audiences, has so taken to rodeo that they put it on all the time. They built their new network and their app around it. And it's going to be a renaissance in the sport in many ways. And they're super serving that audience. And it goes from something that I think was nice to have to CBS to something that's must have. So the identification of properties, getting it into the right channel in front of the right audiences, and then how leadership markets that is really critical. I see real opportunities going forward, and in certain ways, it's going to be an imperative if there's less overall money in the system.
Well, great response.
Mm-hmm.
John, you won't know this, but on the call, we have a friend of Frontrunner. His name is Marty Seymour. So he was the former head of the Western Canadian Agribition, the biggest agricultural show on earth. And he's also a rodeoer himself, doing an array of those events. So Marty, I'm assuming you have a question in light of sort of that, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, you know, we're kind of around the edges of it, John, around kind of the business of all of this. And I think your RFD TV thing, I'm familiar with that and I understand the impact. It got me thinking about, it creates relevancy inside of your constituent. But I watch my friends in the CFL and say, our real problem is we need new fans, not build on the ones we already know. And so it's an interesting problem that's ahead of us if we reinvent how we show up and do professional sports. I wondered if you take the rodeo one and you applied it to other professional sports you're familiar with, is how do we expand our reach? Because my biggest worry is if ticket sales are the anchor of some of these major leagues, like CFL, NHL, and we scrub that, I don't know, the business viability is interesting to me. So how do we expand our customer base?
So I would just mention to you guys, depending upon your timing today, in about an hour, I'm doing another one of these panels for New York VC Sports. And I'm doing an interview with Darren Ravel, sports business reporter who's now at the Action Network, formerly at ESPN and CNBC. Darren has over 2 million Twitter followers and is an example of an individual who sort of used social media to build his profile and understands a lot about the ways that information gets distributed and people find out about things. In general, this requires a savvier understanding of the free networks that I mentioned in my presentation that are sort of revolutionizing content and creates opportunities for younger workers. There are just a lot, if we were starting a business today, the younger staffers at FrontRunner would have totally different ideas of how you got started versus, say, how we did it at ESPN 20 years ago. That gets into customer acquisition, that gets into performance marketing, that gets into use of data, lifetime value, all of these things that are concepts slowly but surely coming to sports. So for instance, with the rodeo guys, a lot of the discussion is, okay, what is going to be our presence on YouTube? Okay, how are we going to work with the local TV stations and RSNs where all the rodeos take place to get more of the word out? How do you balance that versus the exclusivity that RFD is using? When we create an application, how do we market that application? How do we use the NFR, the Super Bowl of rodeo that takes place every December in Las Vegas, and make that more, take advantage of that? David Stern used to talk about understanding your assets and then mobilizing from there. So this is about organization. This is about people power. Nathan talked about, my interest in diverse teams. One of the lessons I learned in my career is that if you assemble the right group of people who have different backgrounds, different ages, come from different places, you will get the benefit of ideas that you didn't have before. That's, to me, the blueprint for a lot of sports, is availing yourself of other things. A lot of the answers to the questions you posed are not rocket science, but they do require working with smart people, listening to them, experimenting, starting other things. So that's how I think you have to do it, which is super serving your core, but to your point, making that core bigger.
I know we've come on the hour, but two final questions. One from my partner, Amanda Dornberg, and we're going to end with your good friend, Ken Madsen, who made the introduction in the first place. Amanda, I'm going to turn it over to you for your question, and appreciate your time.
Thank you. John, I was wondering, you mentioned that if we are to return to, traditional viewership of sports in arenas and venues, that those venues would need to adapt with more technology, sort of driving the way that we're picking up popcorn or food or whatever. So I wonder if you could speak to how you see venture startups in the technology space playing a role in that transformation, and whether you think that some of the leagues' budgets as it pertains to traditional marketing might transform into or be shifted into digital transformation.
So the answer to your second question is absolutely. As you guys are familiar, everybody thinks of these things in terms of like a return on investment. Okay, what should I do with my marketing spend or my investment? How is that going to work for me? I advise a sports data company called Sport Radar, which is a brilliant company doing data around the world. They're very, very big in sports betting. and they're taking a look at all sorts of technologies that could enhance the experience on broadcast, in stadium. We look at and study a bunch of startups for opportunities to tie together. I think the really key thing is, what's the practicality of the idea? And during this hiatus, what work are you doing as a startup to really prepare yourself for what the opportunity could be? There's a company called Clear that provides like a TSA pre-type offering in the US, where, it's an iris and fingerprint scan. That's a company that already was talking about entrance ways into sports, perhaps starting with the Yankees. You could see that kind of technology really take root as we get started, because people are going to want to know that the venue is safe. They're going to want to get into things quicker. They're going to want to do it without necessarily having to have any physical contact with anybody. So plenty of room for opportunity. And in certain ways, I think this advantages startups because they're used to operating with less. They're used to thinking differently. I feel the opportunity is robust.
Thanks, John. And
Thank you.
as mentioned, I'm going to turn it over to your longtime friend and also a luminary, Ken Madsen, there in New York City. Ken, we'll give you the final words. And what is your question for today?
Not really a question, but a comment and a stroke to passion for sports and how important it is, right? So, John, one of the things that my colleagues, my fraternity brothers, the guys we hang out with in college, we get on Zoom calls once in a while, but we're all excited for March 24th when Woods plays Mickelson. And when we talk about this transformation or the new normal, we've already set up that we're going to watch that, get a beer, and we're going to put Zoom on the last couple of holes together so we can watch it together on Zoom. And that mix of technologies there are very interesting. And it's marked on my calendar. I can't wait. That's like a drug. I can't wait to, golf is not my highest sport I like, but it's something. And
yes,
it's going to bring me back in that feeling. So we're realizing how important sports are, not just as the sport in the game, but the community piece of it and sharing it with somebody. I think we're going to, if sports companies embrace that consumer, or the fan, you said, it's going to be different and in a great way.
Yes.
And thank you for participating. I love that you've met some of the people that I'm working with lately, and this is great. This is a great session.
One of the key takeaways was your father's line of least worst, and obviously that's been the reality that we've been dealing with in terms of decision making. But that wasn't today. This was brilliant. I know we could go on for hours of sort of the questions, and really we put this Luminary series together for this very reason, that we can go about our day inspired, and that's what a luminary is. It's someone who inspires sort of others and uses their light to gently cast upon us. And super grateful for your time. I know Jesse made a text to me saying, "Is he hiring?" Because obviously you do have, a pretty phenomenal position in this world. But John, with that, I know you're getting on to another session. They are equally lucky to us, and I know I speak on behalf of all our front runners, some of the biggest sport fans I know, that this time we will never forget. So thank you.
Thank you, guys. Stay well. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Thanks again, Nate.